So I just want to say thank you for giving me an opportunity to share some work that we've been doing. This is, I basically want to talk about some background to the work on irrigation. And I want to talk about the Safi project, which is studying African farmer-led irrigation. I want to talk about some preliminary findings in terms of socioeconomic dimensions of irrigation and policy responses. So I'm aware that, yeah. Okay, so some background to start with. Really in terms of the background to the Safi project was that initial investments in irrigation in the 1960s and 1970s in Africa tried to replicate the Green Revolution in Asia, which had involved improved seeds, fertilizer, and irrigation. And so there was quite a lot of investment, especially after independence in many African countries, to try and replicate the Indian experience, so investment in irrigation projects. But by the 1980s, there was a sense in which these projects hadn't worked. And there was a number of critiques written during the 1990s, which I've indicated here. Bill Adams wrote a scathing critique of the Bakalori irrigation project on the Sokoto River in northern Nigeria, a book called Wasting the Rain. Lyndon Vincent and Chet Dima at Wageningen drew on a lot of experience from North and West Africa. There was a USAID overview of irrigation in Africa, which pointed to high costs, low performance. And Lucas Horst, who was then professor of irrigation at Wageningen University, convened a major conference in 1991 to try and understand why irrigation engineers had not succeeded in designing successful irrigation in Africa. The upshot of this was that there was a hiatus throughout the 1990s in investment in irrigation and indeed in agriculture in Africa. In a sense, this was fostered by the fact that it was a period of falling food commodity prices. So in a sense, although there was widespread concern that African agriculture was stagnating in terms of productivity and falling behind other developing areas such as Latin America or Asia, East Asia, and indeed South Asia, it was still relatively cheap to import food, especially for major cities, especially those on the coast. And I've just signaled here a line which is often repeated: Africa's underused water. Only 4% of the cultivated area is irrigated, as against 35% in Asia. And currently, Africa is using less than 20% of its irrigation potential. So a concern that part of the reason for the low and stagnating productivity of agriculture in Africa was indeed due to the lack of irrigation. Now, this changed at the turn of the century. New initiatives, partly due to the formation of the new economic partnership, the new Partnership for Africa's Development. And part of this was the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Programme, so-called CAADP, which had as its first pillar, it had three other pillars. Its first pillar was to call for reliable water control systems. So really at the outset, when you had a continent-wide approach to try and improve the situation of agriculture, water came in very quickly at the front of the queue, as it were, despite this lack of investment over the previous decade. However, there was another factor, which was the oil price rises in 2006 linked via biofuels to a food price crisis. In other words, oil prices went up, biofuels became fantastically profitable, and a significant part of the United States maize crop diverted into the production of ethanol. That created a shortage of maize on the world market, and you had a big boom in oil prices, a spike in oil prices, which created major problems. This was exacerbated by the fact that countries that had food surpluses and therefore were expected to export refused to export, which of course exacerbated the problem further. So there was, in a sense, a crisis not only of food costs, but also of how the international food market was supposed to work. This led to a sudden interest in food production. All kinds of investors became interested because it was seen to be profitable, and you had what became known as a land grab, people soliciting land where it was perceived to be cheap, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa. So you had sovereign wealth funds from places like Saudi Arabia, you had Chinese government investors, you had many commercial investors from North America and Western Europe, all seeking land. And this became something of an international concern about this. Now, one of the points about this is that foreign investment in agricultural land where it was cheap, whether it was for biofuel or food, it became apparent that these investments generally presumed the availability of irrigation. Now, this set of circumstances meant that African governments and international development agencies started making ambitious plans for irrigation development, often with an agenda for transforming agricultural productivity, so big scale, growth corridors, development areas, and so forth. In practice, large-scale projects have stalled or have been slow to be implemented, except in the case of sugarcane, which is a very particular example where you have a concentrated corporate sector and a flexible use for a variety of products, ranging from ethanol through to sugar. So, on the one hand, you have a lot of interest in developing irrigation. On the other hand, you have relatively slow progress. But at the same time, from around 2005 onwards, you have the emergence of evidence that there was another dynamic going on, that there was a lot of what was known as small-scale private irrigation. This phrase was Charlotte de Freytieur's. She was working for an ag water project in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And she and her co-workers started to bring together evidence that there was a lot of small-scale investment in irrigation. And a figure that was captured in a paper by Namara reckoned that there were 65,000 pumps imported into Ghana alone for irrigation purposes. Now, these pumps were bought by private individuals. So it gives a sense of the scale, and the point being made was that this probably amounted to an investment of about $8 million by individuals in irrigation. Another bit of information was the start of studies using satellite data, and as I'll go on to point out later on, satellite data has proved problematic for looking at irrigation, certainly in sub-Saharan Africa. But as with improving resolution, studies by the International Water Management Institute, IMI, started to produce evidence that irrigation in Africa was 2 or 3 times greater than previously thought. Okay, so that in a sense is some background of where the Safi project came in. The Safi project itself was a response to DFID ESRC Growth Research Programme call for bids, and one of their sub-themes they were interested in was what institutions and policies lead to investment in irrigation by individual farmers, groups of farmers and large-scale enterprises. And so we put together a project titled Assessing the Growth Potential of Farmer-Led Irrigation Development in Sub-Saharan Africa. This was a partnership between African researchers in Mozambique and in Tanzania, and European researchers in Manchester, in Wageningen in the Netherlands, and later in Sheffield and IRD in France and in Edinburgh. These additions happened as people moved institutions, but also as we found new partners who were interested in some of the things that we were looking at. Okay, I want to say something about some prior work on which the Safi project drew. And it's important to recognize this thing didn't just happen out of thin air. Wageningen University had a history of doing some studies in Mozambique over the past decade, the previous decade. One which I would point to is that by Alex Boulding, which was in the border area between Zimbabwe and Mozambique. It's a relatively hilly area going on mountainous, I would say. So there are some fairly inaccessible places. It had been used as a refuge area for people during the period of insecurity in Mozambique, stretching from about 1976 through to about 1992. When there were various elements of insurgency and military action and so forth, and led to a depopulation of much of the area, but these hilly areas provided refuges. Later, after 1980, after 2000, at the time of Zimbabwe's fast-track land reform, where there was a lot of rural disruption within Zimbabwe, you had a movement of people from Zimbabwe into Mozambique, many of whom ended up in this area. Alex's project was basically to try and find out what had been the impact of Zimbabwe's land reform on the areas around, on certain groups of people. And one of the areas he looked at was the border area along the Zimbabwe-Mozambique frontier. And he found, to his surprise, something like 5,000 to 10,000 hectares of what is called hill furrow irrigation, which were completely unknown to the authorities in Mozambique. And he documented this, he mapped some of these areas, and this in a sense led on to further studies, one of which was funded by the World Bank, which was indeed an irrigation, it was a project to try and devise an irrigation policy for Mozambique. And one of the elements of that was a survey of 7 districts in central Mozambique, which was done by Walter Bateman and colleagues, and they found in 7 districts they estimated 10,000 hectares were irrigated against a government figure of what they recognized as being irrigated there, about 1/10 of that. This was followed by another project in a neighboring area, but this focused only on 1 district, and they found double the amount of irrigation that the earlier pro-IRRI estimates had provided. And based on this work, they suggested that in total, this small-scale, unofficial irrigation may be as much as 115,000 hectares in Mozambique, compared to an official figure for formally designed irrigation of 113,000. In other words, what they were suggesting was that the real area irrigated in Mozambique may be double what the official statistics say. And so one of the ideas here was that we should start looking closely at what this irrigation involved and try to get a sense of its dynamics. So we were working in Mozambique. We were also working in Tanzania because there had been prior work in Tanzania. Now, Tanzania has a slightly different irrigation tradition to Mozambique. Government has always recognized irrigation to small-scale irrigation to a greater extent. It has a slightly different colonial history. And indeed, even the colonial authorities recognized that there had been pre-colonial irrigation in areas around Mount Kilimanjaro. And indeed, there's a whole archaeology of irrigation schemes in northern Tanzania. There is evidence, and we came across this ourselves, of government having engaged since the 1930s in developing some improvements. And there was a series of studies that were funded by DFID along the Great Ruaha River, done by Bruce Langford, Tom Franks, and Francis Cleaver not so long ago. So we had some prior information of farmers' development of irrigation in parts of Tanzania. Okay, so just briefly to give a sense of what this farmer-led development of irrigation means. Pumps, obviously. These pumps you may or may not be able to see, one here and another one there. These are actually pumping water from an irrigation canal that belongs to a large sugar plantation. And it's not legal to do so, but it's quite common for farmers to use water wherever it's available by putting these small-scale pumps to take water. Some images here. You can see this pump has been modified and generally repaired in order to keep going. This is a furrow taking water to the fields. You can see there's bits of corrugated iron, bits of polythene and so on, all being put together to make sure the water is guided to where farmers want it to go. This is a low-lying area, rice fields. You can see here this structure that's been put together to raise the level of water in this furrow here and direct it into fields and so on. And you see lots of these kinds of homemade, if you like, systems. Here's another one here. You can see this is a structure that's been put across here. It's reinforced here with wood, but it's essentially earth. This raises the level of water here, but allows it to flow through here. This is a canal here running down the slope, and somebody's put some pipe work here. These are just temporary pipes in order to divert water out into the fields. So some of this stuff is pumped, but quite a lot of it uses gravity. And gravity means that you're going to try and develop irrigation in hilly areas because that's where you can make gravity work to your advantage. Sometimes people take water over very long distances, and so you come across this kind of thing here in the bush. I'm not sure how well you can see this. This is a trench here, probably about a metre or so deep, that someone has dug to take water through the countryside and to their fields. And you come across these kinds of structures in places. This is another homemade thing, which I rather like anyway. This is a bare rock face here, and this is water that's been channeled over that bare rock face, and to make sure it keeps running, somebody's built a little brick wall here to make sure it doesn't just flow out. So in a sense it's creating a channel. And of course there's watering cans, as always, where you can just go and fill them up and take them to water crops. Okay, so the Safi project design, two central questions. So what characterized farmers' own initiatives? What were the social and economic changes associated with them? Whether there was any differentiation? That was the main thing. What was going on with these kinds of systems socially and economically? But also, second question was, what's the perceptions of agricultural development agencies? What do policymakers and others think about these things, and how do they react to them? Because farmers are, after all, doing them themselves. And a third thing which we got involved in, although we hadn't originally planned to, is can we get more accurate estimates of irrigated area, because this was something that became apparent to us, that the level of data was quite problematic. Okay, so fairly quickly now, going through these, the methodology, we basically undertook a set of field studies at different sites, and we also undertook, for the second of these questions, a series of workshops and interviews and policy analysis and so on, looking at the policy reaction to this. And in the field studies, we had a three-phase methodology, basically starting with qualitative, fairly quick characterization of the schemes, then moving on to more in-depth interviews, and finally a survey of irrigating and non-irrigating households in the same area. So we were trying to get a clear sense of what was the difference, of what was the benefit of irrigation. We ended up doing 9 sites in Tanzania, 9 sites in Mozambique, totaling 2,700 and some households. And the sample was initially randomized, but then was adjusted where necessary, so that we had a certain minimum number, generally 50, of non-irrigating households or irrigating households, depending which was in the minority. In the event, we found that it was almost always the non-irrigating households that were in the minority, and therefore we had to, in a sense, search for more non-irrigating households. But we ended up with a sample that ensured that we had both non-irrigating and irrigating households at each site. Right. So these are the sites in Mozambique. You can see mostly they're around the center, the so-called Beira corridor. There are a couple of sites we managed to do in Nampula. We had hoped to do others here, but security problems meant that we couldn't. This is just a sense of what these different sites were. You can see a range of different crops, maize and vegetables, some rice in some areas, the low-lying areas in Sofala, in the hilly areas of Manica, relatively rare to find rice, maize, beans, vegetables mostly. These were this was mostly pumps or buckets on the lower lying areas, but as you can see in the more hilly areas, you managed to have gravity, stream diversions, basically people putting barriers across streams, diverting water out into furrows, and then from there to their fields. I'll just point out in here, one of the criteria we were looking at also was the level of government engagement. And I think it's important to recognize that although these schemes are often undertaken at the initiative of farmers, they are not separated out from the rest of the economy and society. Traders are involved by providing credit often. Government may be involved, and indeed farmers often lobby local government offices for support in improving irrigation schemes, providing a bit of concrete to try and provide lining for canals and so on. And indeed, so there has been, in some instances, some investment, pump schemes here in Lamego and Dondo in Mozambique, for example, but there are equally others where government hasn't had any involvement at all. You can see that in both Mozambique and Tanzania. These are the Tanzanian sites, more widespread, covering the area around Kilimanjaro in the north through to Iringa, Mbeya, and over to Rukwa here. Again, a mix, although rice is much more common here, but commercial market gardening as well here. Maize, beans, onions, tomatoes, and so forth. Again, a mixture of gravity, stream diversions, some pumps. In this case, Macanya, spate irrigation, which basically means that every year you get a great rush of water down the hillside, and they channel it and they spread it over their fields, and then they grow the crops on the resulting infiltrated water. And there was some investment on that. Government had come in and had provided some concrete walls and so on to help them spread the water. Okay, so just now to move on to, fairly briefly, to pick out some key findings. Key thing is, in terms of wealth, irrigators, here in red, are invariably better off. This is an index of housing quality. Bit better off. You can see standards a bit higher in Tanzania. Assets owned, we found that irrigators quite a bit better off. Average area farmed, you found that irrigators tend to have more land in general, not just irrigating land, but in general. One thing to notice here is the much larger areas available to people in Mozambique than in Tanzania, where they barely get a hectare of land. Food security was quite marked. Now I've put this data up for all these sites because I think it's fairly clear that with some exceptions, the irrigators in red tend to be short of food for fewer months than those in blue, in some cases markedly so. So we could say that, okay, if you're irrigating, you're less likely to be short of food. The other thing to notice is that Tanzania, all these Tanzanian sites here, are less short of food than the Mozambican ones, who tend to be in more difficulty from that respect. Women, generally less represented among irrigating households. They go from about 23% in the non-irrigating households down to about 13 or 15% thereabouts in the irrigating ones. They tend to, female-headed households tend to be smaller, tend to be poorer in general. So on those asset scores and so on, they would generally be worse off as well. There is some indication that for female-headed households that irrigate, they may benefit disproportionately from male-headed households. That is to say, if I can put it this way, if you compare irrigating and non-irrigating female-headed households, their reduction in food shortage is 73%, whereas the gap for men would be 33%. That's in Mozambique, 33% in Tanzania. So this, going from non-irrigating, who would be around about 3.5 months of food shortage, going down here about 2.5 months or maybe a bit more, 2.7, but between non-irrigating and irrigating, whereas that difference is less for male-headed households. Now, male-headed households are still better off, but female-headed households tend to be benefit disproportionately. Okay, so I think the thing to be clear about here is that this is commercial farming. It's to generate cash income, and it's driven by urban food markets and commercial trading networks and improved communications, particularly mobile phones, which are critical to harvesting perishable, high-value crops to maximize their market value. Okay? In other words, if you have a perishable crop, normally vegetables, very high value, but you've got to pick it at exactly the right time. You've got to get it to market at exactly the right time. Mobile phones have made a big difference to that. So looking at these data here, if you take this graph down here, this is the contribution of irrigated crops to irrigators' total income. More than half, or about half. That means 80 to 90%, depending where you are, of irrigators regard the income from irrigated crops to be at least half of their income. That's quite a significant proportion. They tend to use inputs, fertilizer, improved seed and so forth, much more than non-irrigators do, and they employ farm labour. In Tanzania, among irrigating households, 70% would hire labour as against 30% for non-irrigating households. So these are people who are moving into commercial crops, and one would even say they are capitalists in that sense. So moving on, the sites we looked at tended to have large numbers of migrants. Now, I don't want to dwell on this overly at the moment, but there is a slight, what we can see here is that there's around 25% of people whose link with the area is via their parents. In other words, one or more of a couple, a household couple, will have a parent who is from that area. Here, 45% would have had a grandparent from that area. The ones in green had no connection whatsoever, no parents, no grandparents, or anything from that area. In other words, in Tanzania, around 25% of people in the area were completely new. In Mozambique, that figure goes up beyond 40%. Now, there's an interesting point here about the linkage with grandparents is there for some, but there are very few people who have links with parents. And I think that has something to do with the period of instability, which meant that there was no settled. These were areas that became depopulated during the war, and therefore, in a sense, that generation was not a settled generation. So there are people who went back to their grandparents' land, but there is a huge number of people who are there for the first time. Well, I think it's very important to bear in mind this sense of population mobility, because in a way it flies in the face of many narratives of rural areas of Africa. But I think that when people start to look and ask questions about where people are from, this is a pattern that is not that unusual. Although perhaps in the case of Mozambique, this particular figure here is very high. But I've seen figures of 30% quite commonly in research, that people are completely new to the area. One of the things that comes with this, and I'm sorry about this, but again I wanted to just put up here, you can't see the figures. This is for people who have irrigated land, how did they get it? Now, market-based acquisition, that's by rented or purchased, amounted to around 24% in Mozambique and around 50% in Tanzania, of which 35% were renting. These are the pale blue, which you can't really see so well here, in Tanzania, whereas in Mozambique the greens and reds, which is allocation either by irrigation association or by a local chief, tends to be more prominent. Inherited land still forms quite a proportion in a number of these sites. But one of the things that one can see, and I think it's worthwhile noting, that the shortage of land in Tanzania, many of these sites, you see quite a high proportion of people getting hold of their irrigated land by renting it from other people. Okay, so these are just some pictures of some irrigated crops, cabbages, green beans, rice, onions, and this is a trader who's just harvested a crop of cabbages. He's going to take it into the market. This is in rural Mozambique. Okay, so how much is this irrigation worth? And this, I suppose, comes to the more difficult part, because this is where we move into somewhat more speculative territory. But I've done my best to try and at least produce some figures which gives a sense of what this might mean in broader terms, the wider economy. These are some figures here for the gross value of crop sales. I've reduced all these numbers to US dollars because we have different currencies in Mozambique and Tanzania, obviously. Now you can see this huge difference between the amount of the value of what's sold between irrigating and non-irrigating households, both in Tanzania and Mozambique. Tanzania is 5 times, in Mozambique it's 13 times. What is this actually? This is the average gross irrigated crop sales per, this is the average. So Mozambique worth 700 or so US dollars per year, Tanzania a bit more. This is average across all sites in those countries. I've just tried to compare that with minimum wage for agriculture, which is 660, you can see 545. So advantageous, especially since this is almost certainly going to be seasonal work. Less comparable in some ways with industrial minimum wages. But nonetheless, it is, one could argue that the gross income, and I mentioned it's gross income, is 45 minutes. Okay, is significant. It varies. One can see here, just draw attention to the fact that female-headed households tend to have lower incomes than men, and it varies from place to place. This one is a sort of failed site. This one is the spate irrigation one I talked about, has lower figures. But equally in other places, figures are much higher. So variable. Is it significant for the wider economy? Okay, well, one of the questions we had here was, okay, so how much is there? How much of this is there? And I know that I'm running short of time, so I'm going to run through this very quickly now. Essentially, official data is only collected through surveys. Those are relatively infrequent. This is a place of rapid growth of irrigation. There have been efforts to use remote sensing data. We were very fortunate in the sense that new high-resolution satellite data became available, and we were able to team up with Sam Bowers and Casey Ryan at Edinburgh University, and we ran some tests to see if we could estimate irrigated areas using radar images. I won't go into this now because I don't have time, but these are the kinds of figures we came up with, or the kinds of images you can come up with the pink bits, essentially the irrigated areas. And I just want to say very briefly, this is the figure that FAO says exists in terms of irrigation in Shinyanga region. And if you go through, these are the agricultural census data from 2002, 2007. So already tripling almost from one census to another. And this was the figure that we came up with. Note the uncertainty here, plus or minus 37,000, but a big number, 250,000 hectares in that region, as against the figure of 2,000 or so officially. Now, let's go through to the next thing. This is another region, Rukwa. Our estimate using radar analysis was that it had 36,000 hectares, plus or minus 11,000 and so. The average additional value of gross sales of irrigated crops, in other words, if you take away what the people without irrigation would have been selling, and you just have the difference then, that's in a sense the advantage of having irrigation. So you say, okay, this is the additional value just from irrigation. That gives you, for this kind of area, it gives you something between $22.8 and $44.4 million of value produced by irrigation in one region. I've just put up some figures here. The disbursed budget by the Tanzanian government for 2015-16 was 2.2 million. The approved budget for 2016-17 was 16 million, so around about half. And even for the flagship agricultural policy, the amount to be invested in irrigation is around 188 million per year. So these numbers are not in completely different ballparks. So the value of irrigation that is being produced by farmers is actually comparable with the kinds of levels of investment being made by the government for the entire country. Okay, I think one of the things here is, well, in terms of policy responses, is seeing or not seeing irrigation. Many trained engineers expect irrigation to look like this. And therefore, if you see this, which is an irrigated landscape, you may not see the irrigation. This is in Banduzi in Mozambique. Now, we conclude that there are benefits in terms of this kind of farmer-led development of irrigation, raises productivity. Arguably, it's cheaper for government than large-scale irrigation schemes, and it certainly makes greater use of farmers' local knowledge. However, it increases water use, and therefore there are issues of competition. It may well be about to accentuate existing social and economic inequality. There are questions about unregulated pesticide use, which are definitely of a concern. But above all, I think it challenges regulatory authorities. What do you do about this process? And I think one of the things that we would talk about is that even if farmers' development initiatives were to be recognised, if they are no longer seen as non-commercial subsistent cultivators of only rain-fed crops, and if they were to be perceived now as entrepreneurial users of major quantities of water, then they will move into some very highly politicised policy arenas in which the politics of water allocation is dominated by highly organised and politically influential lobbies. And you can see the ones I've listed here: hydropower, urban water supply, wildlife, tourism, international investors. And all of these have form in terms of gaining preferential access to water at the expense of agriculture. And it's fair to say, we know this from talking to policymakers, that there is a dominant, if simplistic, view of small-scale irrigators as wasteful users of water. And this suggests they will start from a very weak political position in competing for water. And there are some documented cases of this happening. So key questions for small-scale farmers relate to water charges and water rights. Will they acquire water rights in exchange for registration of water use and payment of water charges? Currently, there's a sense that small-scale irrigators don't pay fees because individually they don't use a lot of water. But the flip side of that is, if they're not registered as water users, then they don't have clear rights when it comes to competing with others. The prospect of small-scale water users also poses questions for overall water resource use planning, which is heavily tilted towards a conservationist stance premised on water as a scarce resource. Okay, last February, this is the last thing. Last February, we got together some policymakers for a 3-day workshop which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation to interrogate the evidence about farmer-led development of irrigation and government responses to it. The outcome of that meeting was a set of recommendations, and these are here. It's also I didn't realise you would have this, it's also in the policy brief, which I think a number of you have got there. So the first is really about normalising farmers' use of water as part of broader policy processes rather than a matter of designing enclaves of modern agriculture seeking to substitute existing farming patterns. Now, such an approach would address the emerging risks, inequality, and constraints, roads, storage, reliable electric power supply, which small-scale commercial agriculture faces. The second of these things, of these recommendations, focuses on the diversity of irrigation that results where farmers influence its purpose, design and operation. And this points to a need to create a capacity for adaptive and more context-sensitive engineering input to irrigation design. Clearly, better data is a requirement. I think everybody recognises that. But finally, and perhaps most difficult, how to balance a recognition of small-scale irrigators' activities in a way that regulation of their water use in the wider interest does not stifle the initiative of individuals. So I think there's a balancing act here. And I think really this is the challenge for regulation. Thank you.